Chapter 17, Dre, Honored Guests. Dre was in the entrance of a vast room. A forest of jagged stone pillars reached upwards, like the fingers of an army of rock giants. They approached, but never reached the soaring ceiling that was completely covered in the same glowing moss that was scattered throughout the dungeon. Dre had heard tales of ancient cathedrals designed for dark gods. He'd always imagined them looking much the same. The two of them walked into the room, the monsters behind them escorting them forward, like honored guests soon to be presented. Dre had thought that an army of monsters had been behind him, but as his gaze lowered from the impressive heights of the room, he saw that the true army was now before him. Creatures covered the floor of the cavern, except for a precisely straight path that cut through the room. They lay, unnaturally prostrate, upon the ground, like a field of wheat on reaping day. In honor? Supplication? Perhaps even worship? Dre couldn't tell. He didn't think he even wanted to know. The room was eerily silent, except for the rhythmic sound of their footfalls. The air was filled with the acrid stench of diseased wounds and rotting flesh. Dre was entirely overwhelmed by his surroundings. Nothing made sense anymore. It took all of his focus just to put one foot in front of the other, as the two of them slowly made their way through this underground world of terror. His mind and body felt completely numb from overexposure to the nearly constant state of fear he had been in for what felt like forever. Such comforting dullness vanished, though, when his attention was drawn to an entirely new source of dread. There was something waiting for them at the end of the path formed from lack of monster flesh. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but so many things about it seemed wrong. As each step drew Dre closer, though, terrible details came into focus. A moss-covered antler rose from the side of a relatively human-like face, except that the half of the face opposite the antler seemed formed from moss, not just covered by it. The throne upon which the thing sat was a twisted conglomeration of moss-covered wood and bones that were so white they seemed to shine. It was huge, and the scale of it made Dre realize that the man-creature sitting upon it, looking proportional, must also be monstrously sized. The thing had a huge, slanted smile on its face. But wait, Dre knew that smile, and he knew it well. It filled his childhood. But no, that was impossible. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. With growing horror, pieces of the puzzle began to click into place within his mind. This was clearly the dungeon bound of this dungeon, and he was not slave, but master. As Dre drew closer to the dais, the smile grew and grew on the being's face. He mourned that he was able to make out the sarcastic humor in that smile, the intelligent yet malicious gleam in its eye. How could it be? He was in Raven, getting trained in herbology. He had been so excited to finally leave Neridany. But it was becoming far too clear. He could no longer be distracted from a truth that he had subconsciously known since he had first laid eyes upon the dungeon bound. It was Javan. Dre didn't want to believe it, but he knew it to be true even before the creature that had once been his brother spoke in a voice that had lowered an octave and aged a few decades, but was still recognizable as Javan's.
"Brother, it is so good of you to join us."
Javan raised a hand, and the mass of previously statuesque creatures moved. They rose from their bowed positions and started making their own characteristic calls, in a strange parody of a human crowd responding to a speaker. The raucous sounds combined into a terrible symphony of sound that reverberated through the cavern. Javan lowered his hand, and within a single heartbeat, there was once again complete silence.
"Your friends have been waiting for you."
This time he pointed to a row of large creatures. The bears, elk, and even a moose moved out of Dre's vision so that he could see a line of bloody and exhausted-looking men and women. They just stood there, like lifeless dolls. Their bodies, too motionless. Their faces, too blank. The members of Raven's militia were unbound, but there wasn't even a spark of resistance in a single one of them.
"Bow!"
Javan shouted, and the line of human puppets instantly dropped to their knees and stretched out their bodies in supplication. They pressed their faces hard against the rough stone floor, too hard, in an apparent effort to bow as low as possible.
"It is truly surprising to me how easily the human spirit is broken. A little pain, a few examples, A show of unstoppable power, and voila, that ineffable spark of humanity. It's just gone.
Javan said this as he gestured to an area where another group of animals moved to reveal what remained of a human carcass. All that was left were scraps of bloody hair and fabric. Dre turned towards Adian in horror, but Adian didn't return the look. His head was lowered. Whether in remorse or prayer, Dre didn't know. But in a misplaced moment of spite, he found himself angry at Adian for his faith. What had his prayers brought them but misery, pain, and failure? He was pulled from his thoughts as Javan spoke again.
Brother, you wound me. I have brought together all of my forces in your honor, and you have yet to even acknowledge me.
A tone of mock hurt laced through his words, but a deep anger could be seen in his eyes that had once been brown, but now shone with a sickly green glow.
Do you think yourself better than me even still?
Dre tried to clear his completely parched throat with little success. He spoke in as loud a croak as he could manage.
Javan, what's going on here? Why are you doing this? And what do you mean? I never thought of myself better than you. You were always the favorite, always knew exactly what you wanted to do with your life.
Javan released a loud, guffawing laugh. He was joined by a chorus of animal cackles that took the form of growls, screeches, and snorts as the creatures joined in his mirth.
So naive, brother, as always. I didn't choose the herbalist class. Did you really think I would choose something so mundane, so ordinary?
He angrily spat the words out, and then gestured to the glowing moss that formed the right half of his face.
I am a Durak, a class of power. But power does not come easily. There are always trade-offs, always side effects. But for the power, it was all worth it.
He raised his hands, and all the creatures filling the cave, like worshippers in a temple, released a roar of sound nearly as loud as Adian's sonic boom skill. He flinched away from the painful noise, and once again his brother laughed.
I am Java no longer. You will call me Tega, short for Schistostega,
he said, and gestured to the moss-covered ceiling. He continued.
I told you of it once. Do you remember?
Dre tried to speak, but he couldn't force any words out, so instead, he just nodded.
Tega sneered. Am I not worthy of your words? He growled, but then shook his head. It's no matter. You will soon learn your place. But as I was saying, since only herbalists and other such classes would understand the full name, which I fully admit is quite the mouthful, Tega it will be.
He raised both hands in an all-encompassing gesture, and then raised his head to stare out into the vastness of the cavern before him.
This is my dungeon. I am bound to it just as surely as it is bound to me. Once I gained my Durak class, which, for simplicity's sake, I will allow you to think of as a sort of corrupted druid, I started journeying into the woods to find useful plants and experimenting on animals that I found. It was slow going, and I was incompetent at first, but that all changed once I met well, you have no need for such details. Suffice it to say that I was recruited into an organization that helped me along this path. In return, all they asked for was a little loyalty when the time comes.
He laughed.
Look at me rambling like villains in all the stories. Let me get back to the point. You asked me why I am doing this? Did you truly never notice? You were the younger brother, and yet you belonged in a way that I never did. You were so useful to our parents, their little faithful laborer. The son who always did what he was told, what he was supposed to. Well, I, on the other hand, was a loner, friendless, an outcast, useless.
Tega paused. His eyes burned bright. His breaths came heavily, but Dre didn't understand why. What his brother was saying wasn't how he remembered their childhood at all. Dre's confusion only grew as Tega regained enough composure to continue.
Of course, all that pales when compared to your true sin. Do you remember that it was I who invited Asya to our home for the first time? That I introduced you to her? Of course you don't. The only girl I ever loved only had eyes for my younger brother. She was supposed to be mine, but you stole her from me. Then you had the audacity to hold her at arm's length. You took my treasure and treated her like trash."
By this point, Tega's voice was like rolling thunder, and his eyes shone as bright as green lightning. Dre could barely believe what he was hearing. Never once had Javan spoken to him of this. He wanted to reply, but the words caught in his throat. So silence fell heavy around them, suffocatingly so. Slowly, ever so slowly, the gleam of Tega's eyes dimmed. When he spoke again, his voice was soft and his tone measured.
"But it's okay, brother. It may be too late for me. I am long past the weakness of love. But you are in luck, for I still have some small capacity for mercy. I'm going to give you a chance to redeem yourself, to prove your love for Asya once and for all."
Dre's mind raged with a battle between confusion, anger, and guilt. He regretted that he had never noticed his brother's affection for Asya. In hindsight, it did make some sense, and Asya had always claimed that she suspected Javan of having a crush on her. It was becoming clear that their bond as brothers was never quite as close as Dre had thought. It was also possible that he was primarily to blame. He had always been self-centered, with his thoughts, if not his actions. However, Dre refused to concede what this monster, whom he had once called brother, seemed to be implying. That Dre was to blame for the evil before him. But he couldn't say that, could he? Tega held all the power, and his humanity seemed all but lost. The only chance any of them had of getting out alive was to play along with the insanity. But what madness did Tega have planned? How was he supposed to prove his love? Dre searched the monstrous and yet familiar face before him, but he didn't recognize the cold, wicked smile he found there. The implied cruelty in it opened up a world of horrendous possibilities. Tega slowly walked behind his ghastly throne. He bent with his broad back towards Dre and gently picked something up from the ground. He slowly turned, and Dre's heart forgot how to beat. It was Asya. Tega cradled her like an infant in his large arms. She was bound and gagged with strips of cloth that appeared to have been torn from a now tattered dress that barely upheld her modesty. She appeared mostly unharmed, but her body was still, terrifyingly so, her face frozen in a rictus of horror. She didn't seem to be aware of Dre's presence, or of much of anything for that matter, and Dre was glad for it. Conscious awareness was nothing but a curse in their current crisis. A curse that Dre was unsure he could continue to bear. He looked down and realized that his legs had failed him, and he had fallen to his knees. Dre was lost. He turned to Adian, a small part of him still clinging to the hope that he could once again come to the rescue. But Adian had no answer. He too was on his knees, his head bowed. Dre looked back up at Tega, who towered over him, so close that Dre could reach out and touch him. His voice cracked as he half shouted, half sputtered.
"How? Why? Why did you bring her here?"
Tega's cruel smile widened.
"I didn't bring her here. She fortuitously came right to me. She followed your little militia to the dungeon entrance. She watched and waited, but when you didn't return, she entered the dungeon of her own accord. She handled it much better than you did, little brother. She was barely fazed by the gruesome aftermath of that auditory attack."
He turned his attention to Adian before continuing.
"Impressive skill. I was most definitely not expecting an attack of that magnitude from a bard of all classes. You who started out as such a useful tool have become a hindrance. It's hard for me to get too upset with you, though. After all, not only did you draw my attention to a weakness of my minions, but you are the one I have to thank for bringing my brother to me so soon. I had expected that our reunion would be some time in coming. My impatient nature is in your debt."
Dre watched as Adian, who had lifted his head to look at Tega, once again dropped his gaze to the floor. Tega gave a short bark of a laugh, and then returned his attention to Dre. He picked up where he had left off, as if his sidebar with Adian had never occurred.
"I know this may seem cruel, but loving someone means doing what's best for them, even if it hurts everyone at the moment. Trust me, when I say that I have your long-term prospects in mind. You desperately need to learn a little humility, a little selflessness. You need to put yourself in someone else's shoes and think of their needs ahead of your own, little brother. To live in a society is to sacrifice for the greater good. It's important that you realize you aren't the center of the universe, and maybe you aren't even better than me.
Dre didn't have the wherewithal to poke holes in the logic of the monster that was once his brother, but one thing was so glaringly wrong that he couldn't help but ask,
"If you ever cared for Asya, how could you treat her so?"
Take aside, like a weary master re-explaining the obvious to an apprentice.
As I said, caring for someone isn't always doing what they want. It is providing what they need. Asya needs to feel loved. She needs to see that you will put her best interests ahead of your own. Don't you understand? I'm doing this because I care. I'm sacrificing my time, delaying my plans to provide you with this opportunity.
He sighed again, this time in resignation.
I suppose it is too much to ask for you to be grateful at the moment, but perhaps in time you will understand.
Before Dre had a chance to reply to that lunacy, Tega raised his fingers towards the prostrate line of humans that Dre had all but forgotten about. They quickly pried themselves off of the rough floor and dashed madly towards the throne. When they arrived at Tega's feet, they aggressively bowed again. Tega knelt slowly, with Asya still frozen in shock, cradled in his arms. He laid her gently at Dre's feet before he reached down to his waist and unsheathed an ornate dagger whose tip released an almost blinding green glow. Dre flinched as Tega tossed the weapon into the air and caught it by the flat of the blade. He stared at it for a moment or two before he stretched out his arm and extended the hilt towards Dre.
The moment of reckoning has arrived. Now you must choose, little brother. Who shall live and who shall die?